Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman Chung, Minister Yun, and President Kim. Thank you for asking me to speak at this very prestigious forum and with such distinguished company. I'd also like to congratulate the authors of the Global Survey report, which has laid out a broad range of issues that we need to consider when we look at our future. What I thought I'd do is, since I agree with much of what's been said before, is really to speak briefly on how I see the world as we find it today, on the responses to this situation, and on whether the peace on which our prosperity depends will continue to hold in maritime Asia. The way I would describe the world today, frankly, is as a world adrift between orders. But as Bilahari just reminded us, this is the normal state of the world in history. I mean, world orders are a historical anomaly. But what we have today is a unique situation in one sense. It may be fragmenting politically, but it's still globalized economically to an extent that it's never been before. All the major powers have emerged diminished from the COVID pandemic with much more uncertain domestic politics, and globalization is being redefined as we see, and politics is now in command of the world economy. Indeed, frankly, domestic politics in China and the US could have as much or maybe even more influence on international affairs as their relationship with each other or the shifting international balance of power. 2024 is said to promise 70 general elections around the world. And what we've seen recently is you saw Ukraine, a war about European security order having global economic and political effects. The same with the Israel-Hamas conflict. And as a consequence of both, the West is more united than ever and yet more isolated globally than ever. The 2020s are likely to be the bloodiest decade since the end of the Cold War. And just the last 2.5 years have seen renewed escalated violence in Myanmar, Ukraine, Sudan, Nagorno-Karabakh, Israel, Gaza. I mean, it's just adding on to the existing conflicts. So where does this leave us in maritime Asia, which so far has managed to avoid this problem? Because we too have rising factors of uncertainty, the shifting balance of power, the rise of China and others. Power is now diffused in a way it wasn't, particularly in Northeast Asia. The provision of global public goods is in doubt. And we have a ring of security dilemmas and flashpoints in China's periphery, right through maritime Asia, from the Mediterranean through India to Japan. And most important, we have no real movement on the transnational issues or challenges like climate change, developing country debt, terrorism, pandemics, etc. It's been decades since there was a binding international agreement on a significant transnational issue. Because ultimately, the multilateral system, which is based on the power of member states, of sovereign member states, is made ineffective by great power rivalry. And to blame or to find a solution in multilateral mechanisms for disorder, to my mind in this situation, is really to look in the wrong place for the solution. Because the system, the multilateral system, can only be as effective as the member states want it to be. And if they are quarreling among themselves, I don't see how it can be effective at all. So what happens? In this kind of uncertainty, states seek maximum strategic autonomy. And this could work for those who are capable. Others seek the security of an order or of powerful patrons, of allies. But both categories also seek restraints on their adversaries, whether through a rule-based order or balancing arrangements. Today in Asia, we see balancing, hedging, bandwagoning, all at the same time. I know the theory says this is impossible, but it's happening. What I would call general unalignment. And even the allies are hedging. While the US-centered hub and spokes has been strengthened in the last 10 years, but so has cooperation between countries in a belt from India to Korea and Japan in defense and security and in intelligence. Responses naturally vary depending on capability and relative power or agency. Great power rivalry actually constrains the greatest powers. Today, that would be the US and China. While a world between orders creates space and increases the agency of middle powers. And you can see this in Korea, in Saudi Arabia, in Israel's actions, in Iran and others, who are much more active in their regions. And there is, however, a loss of agency and therefore alienation among some of the weaker and smaller powers. And we can see this where the West, frankly, is losing the global South, especially after its reaction to Israel's retaliation against Hamas terrorism on October 7th. So will the Asian peace hold? It's clear that the risk of war is growing. What has kept the peace and enabled the prosperity, to my mind, has been the balance of power and the balance of terror, and both are fraying or shifting, and they need tending. The balance of power is not automatic. There's no invisible hand in international relations. But I would tend to think that direct great power conflict is still unlikely. Partly for the reasons that Bilahari mentioned, China and the US are members of one global system. They cannot decouple economically or enter into conflict without grievously damaging themselves. Unlike the Cold War, this is not a Cold War. I agree. China and the US are not engaged in proxy wars. They're part of the same system. And we've seen attempts to set a floor to their contention last week in San Francisco. But the problem is that stability at higher levels of conflict often means violence at lower levels, whether civil wars, terrorism, asymmetric violence, and we can see that that's much more likely and prevalent. So, 3 quick final thoughts. For me, chasing stability when in a state where the world is adrift between orders is really a chimera. While all states recite the mantra of strategic stability, it's their unhappiness with their present place in the world that's the source of uncertainty, tension, and conflict. And when the greatest powers themselves are now revisionist, including China and the US, stability, frankly, is not an achievable goal. Besides, technology, politics are changing that balance of power so rapidly in a world of revisionists that I don't think stability is really what we should be chasing. Should we be chasing a world order or a world of multiverses, of regional balances in a globalized economy? The question really is, should we be looking at Bismarck or Wilson? Our task, it seems to me, is to manage change, to manage the transition, even if it is not to a new world order, but to several orders. And for that, I think what we are seeing is actually the emergence of issue-based coalitions of the willing and able. And these vary depending on what the issue is, on what the geography is. So I would say that that really would be the way to go forward, managing change and not necessarily depending on the multilateral system entirely, or trying for an institutional solution to what is really a structural problem in the world order. Thank you very much.
네.